to Bhikkhu Bodhi and to Chuangzi Monastery for this invitation. I'm really delighted to be here today. It's always very joyful for me to visit this beautiful place and to spend time with Bhante and everyone else as well. I'd like if we could begin with a moment of silence to let our mind settle. So if I could ask you just to close your eyes and follow your breath for maybe a minute. Let go of our thoughts and expectations. I'd like to begin with a short quotation from the Zen poet Gary Snyder. About 50 years ago, he published an essay on Buddhist anarchism, and it included these sentences within it. The mercy of the West has been social revolution. The mercy of the East has been individual insight into the basic self/void. What we might say now as realizing the emptiness of the self, something like that. And then he concludes, we need both. Another way to say that might be that the highest ideal of the Western tradition, certainly in the modern world, has been social justice. The concern to restructure our societies so that they're more socially just. And we can think of so many examples. Democracy itself would be the basic one, but also our general concern for human rights. Think about the Bill of Rights attached to the Constitution, anti-slavery movements, civil rights campaigns, more recently, feminism and women's issues, for example, abortion, whether gays can get married, even things like out in front in the parking lot. There are certain places reserved for disabled people. This general concern of the West has been, I think, really one of our major focuses as a civilization as a whole. On the other side, we could say that the highest ideal or the main concern of the Buddhist tradition has been waking up. In Buddhist terms, we speak about realizing our true nature, which is also realizing the true nature of the world because they're not really separate from each other. And to say that we need both, as Gary Snyder did, it doesn't mean, I think, simply that these two ideals go well together. But what I really want to argue is that more fundamentally, these two projects need each other if they're going to be successful enough. And I think we're in a situation now where we can see this. And it seems especially important nowadays because in our globalizing or globalized civilization, we're also very aware that we have global-sized crises, problems, predicaments. And what I think is important is to see how the coming together of these two ideals or two projects can give us a different perspective on the situation we're in and also suggest to us or imply in certain ways different ways of responding to it. So that's what I plan to talk about. First of all, talking a little bit about the Western tradition, the highest ideal of the West, turning to the Buddhist tradition, and then finally spending a little bit of time pointing out some of the distinctive things about about a Buddhist perspective on social issues. So that's the plan of attack for this talk. And it occurs to me that a very good way to distinguish the Western focus from the Buddhist focus is to start by looking at the different roles of morality or ethics within the Abrahamic traditions. And by Abrahamic, I mean primarily, of course, Judaism and Christianity, Islam. So the religious traditions that have been most important for the West, distinguishing between those, their attitude toward morality or ethics, from the Buddhist perspective. Because although there are many similarities, there's also some really distinctive differences, especially when we look at the different function, the different role of morality in those two different traditions. When we talk about the Abrahamic religions, we often speak of them as the best examples of ethical monotheism, right? And when we do that, we usually focus on the monotheism, that is to say, the idea that they're talking about one God. But I want to focus on the ethical, because it seems to me, when we look at the Abrahamic traditions, this is at the heart of what it means to be religious. In other words, to be a good Jew, good Christian, good Muslim, the focus is almost always on living up to a certain kind of moral standard. That the primary way that God relates to us is that he tells us how to live. He gives us rules, with the implication that if we do what he says, we'll be taken care of in some way, and if we don't, we're going to get into trouble, right? And this goes all the way back to the very beginnings of the Abrahamic traditions, the Genesis story of Adam and Eve. For someone like myself looking at that story, it seems to be a fable about the development of self-consciousness or self-awareness, right? Adam and Eve, they eat the apple or whatever, the fruit, from the tree of good and evil. And that's very distinctive, good and evil, right? And they become aware of themselves as naked. That is to say, they become self-conscious in a way that they weren't before. They make rough clothes for themselves, fig leaf, whatever, and then they hide from the face of God when he comes wandering through the garden later on. So it's a very interesting fable about self-consciousness, and yet it's quite striking that the emphasis in the way the story is told is that it's an act of disobedience. It's the primal sin against God. So even at the very beginning of human history, even at the very beginning of human civilization, it's understood to be the result of an act of disobedience. The fact that they eat from the tree of good and evil, I think that's pointing to really the distinctive axis of the tradition. Because if you want to pick out what's the really crucial issue, it's which side are we on? Are we on the side of the good or the evil? And for many Judeo-Christians, this world is kind of a battleground where God and Satan are sort of fighting it out. And the really important issue is which side are we on? Let me ask about the sound. Are we okay? We seem to be getting a little bit of echo up here. Can you hear okay out there? I think that's being adjusted. And then it goes down from there. So you start out with Adam and Eve, and then what's the next thing comes to mind? Well, the big flood, right? Noah's Ark and that. God basically decides to drown almost everybody, with a very few exceptions. Why? Because we're not living in the way that he wants us to live. I sometimes wonder about the poor animals, one pair of each, but I'm not sure what all the other animals did to deserve their fate, but we're not told about that in the story. So, but that's really important. And then later on, of course, kind of the centerpiece is the relationship, this kind of contract or covenant that's made between God and the Israelites, and that has to do with the Ten Commandments, the Decalogue. So once again, God is telling us how to live, and there's some implication that he will somehow take care of us if we live that way, right? Getting on a bit later, you get to Jesus. Jesus adds a couple interesting things to it. He has a more personal relationship with God. He talks about God as Abba, Father. And he, maybe with a little help from Paul, he talks a lot more about love. But this doesn't abrogate the ethical focus of the tradition. It's still this really crucial issue. Are we living in the way that God wants us to live? So I think you can get a sense of what I'm talking about here. I shouldn't belabor the point too far, but just that I think the core of the Abrahamic traditions is this concern, good versus evil. And you may wonder why I'm going on about it at such length when in the contemporary world an awful lot of people, including maybe most of us here in this hall, we're not maybe accepting that way of understanding the world. But here's the point. Even though we may not accept the Abrahamic God, I think this is still our favorite story. It's still, in some way, our favorite lens, our favorite way of understanding and relating to the world. And I offer you as evidence our films and our TV shows, right? I grew up with James Bond, right? Remember? James Bond. That's kind of an interesting case there, because how do you know that James Bond is a good guy? I mean, you know, he likes to drink a lot, and he seems very self-indulgent, gambles, obviously has a lot of women, right? So how do we know he's a good guy? We know he's a good guy because he's fighting against the bad guys. I'll come back to that in a moment. But there's other examples, not just James Bond, Harry Potter, my son's generation, Lord of the Rings, one of my favorite fantasy books, which we talked about in that little book that was mentioned earlier, The Dharma of Dragons and Demons. Many more examples. What else? I'm sure you can think of some as well. Hunger Games. And that's kind of an interesting one, because in the Hunger Games, you notice that I haven't seen the second film, but she and a couple of her friends are working against society or the social system, which is very corrupted, right? That's sort of the focus, that there's a corrupt social system, which I think is, again, very revelatory about the way we understand what's necessary in order to have social justice. The focus is on institutional change with laws and regulations, changing who controls us, changing how we organize our societies. So we can go on and on. Television shows. I guess I don't watch very much television, but I'm always surprised when I do how much people just love these crime shows, right? It's always the good guys trying to find the bad guys. It just goes on and on. People don't seem to lose interest in that. Detective novels, it's the same sort of thing. So I think you get my point. We still have this fundamental lens. This is still very deep in our civilization and our culture to see the world in terms of good and bad. We continue to be fascinated by it. I think it's our number one pair of spectacles. And the fact that it's a pair, in a way, points to some of the problems that I want to spend a little time looking at from a Buddhist perspective. From a Buddhist perspective, I think we can say that the duality between good and evil is, well, both good and evil. Or to use more Buddhist language, both wholesome and unwholesome. And I want to spend a few minutes just sort of looking at both of those, starting with the unwholesome side. Right? What does it mean to say that the duality between good and evil is unwholesome or problematic? Well, good versus evil is a kind of classic example of dualistic thinking, or what's sometimes called bipolar thinking. Other obvious examples are things like big, small, tall, short, light, dark, etc., right? Now, a lot of those examples are very innocuous, but here's the point. Some of them are very charged because we make the distinction between the two because we want one of them and we don't want the other. The problem, however, is that with dualistic thinking, you can't have one without the other because the meaning of each is the negation of the other. Let me explain what I mean by that. For example, big, small. If you don't understand the word small, the meaning of the word small, you don't really know what big means, do you? And vice versa. Or if you don't understand what the word light means, you don't understand what dark means, something like that. In other words, we don't really have two concepts, we have two sides of the same concept. And the way they work is the meaning of each is the negation or the opposite of the other. And sometimes this isn't just a kind of logical point, but it can become psychologically very problematic. Let me give you an example. Pure and impure. Another example of dualistic thinking. If the most important thing, or a very important thing, is for you to live a pure life, what does that mean? It means that you will be preoccupied with impurity, with avoiding impurity, because that's what it means to live a pure life. You don't know what's pure until you know what's impure. And if the focus is on trying to live a pure life, you've got to have your radar out for impure situations to avoid. Do you see? There's other examples that one can give, but the one, and I think in a way this is sort of the classic, is the duality between good and evil. In this case, we don't know what is good until we know what is evil. And psychologically, we can't feel that we are good unless we are fighting against the evil. You can see the issue here. And preferably, of course, an evil outside ourselves. And I think historically we can see so many ways in which this has been acted out throughout the history of Western civilization. Think of all the heresy trials, inquisitions, and more recently, I would offer to you the war on terror. What was the difference between Osama bin Laden and President George W. Bush? In a way, they were doing the same thing. They were both fighting the holy war of good against evil. The difference between them, of course, is that they reversed what the one thought was good, the other thought was evil, and vice versa. But nonetheless, it was the same holy war in the sense that in order to feel that you are good, you are fighting against the evil. And the other side of evil, of course, is that once you've identified something as evil, you don't have to make further efforts to understand it. Once something has really been identified as evil, the whole point is to focus on destroying it, defeating it in some way. We could say a bit more about the war on evil and how paradoxically I think our attempt to destroy terrorists has possibly created more terrorists. In the sense that every terrorist, whether they're terrorists or not, they have relatives, families, friends. And I sometimes wonder whether there are more people now who hate the United States than at the time of 9/11. But what's important here is to see the general point, which is this. One of the main causes of evil in our world has been our attempts to destroy evil. That's the terrible irony, you see. What was somebody like Hitler trying to do when he was trying to exterminate the Jews, the Romani gypsies, the homosexuals? He's trying to purify the earth for the Aryan race by getting rid of the impurities, the things that mess the world up. What was Stalin trying to do when he devastated, destroyed the kulaks, the slightly well-to-do, or basically the peasants who had a little bit more than most people, a little bit more land than the others? In order to create his ideal society of collective farms, Stalin ended up exterminating hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of kulaks. Mao Zedong, with the landlords in China, the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia with any educated person or urban person, and on it goes. We can give examples. Now, those examples, curiously, they're not, strictly speaking, religious examples, Hitler, Stalin, Mao Zedong, except in the sense that you might think about communism as a kind of secular religion, and arguably one could. But I think you can see the point here. Again, just to emphasize it, the danger of this duality between good and evil, which I'm arguing has been so central to the Western tradition, is that it actually ends up creating evil. So that's what I would call the unwholesome side. And I think a Buddhist perspective that emphasizes the way that our ways of thinking can deceive and mislead us. I think that helps us see the problem. Nonetheless, there's also a really important, what I would call a wholesome side to the duality between good and evil. And for this, I would go back to the roots of the Jewish tradition in the prophets. If you read the Old Testament, there's a number of books that tell the stories of the prophets. What are the prophets doing? Well, they're doing a lot of things, but one of the main things they're doing is they're going before the kings and the rulers, and they're saying to them, look, you guys are not living in the way that God wants you to. You are oppressing the poor, the widows, the orphans. You are taking advantage of them, and because of that, God will punish you, right? This is what they're doing. They're speaking truth to power. They're saying, you are not ruling in a socially just way. And then they would run back to the hills and their sheep and whatever, since they had to be a little careful in that situation, right? Now, this started, as far as I can see, this is where this concern for social justice begins. And again, it's all about the good and evil, right? The kings, according to the prophets, are not ruling in a just way. They're ruling in ways that God disapproves of and that God will punish them for. So here's where it gets interesting. You have this concern for social justice coming out of the Jewish Judeo-Christian tradition. And that, of course, is one of the main roots of the modern West. But don't forget the other root. The other source of the Western tradition is Greece, Athens, the Greek tradition. And what did the Greeks contribute? This momentous distinction that they discovered between what they called phusis and nomos. I don't need to go into this in detail, but basically what the Greeks realized is something that prior people didn't really understand very much, that our social arrangements, the way that we live together, these are not God-given, they're not natural in the way that our ecosystems are. If we don't like the way, if we don't like the kind of social arrangements we have, we can change them. That was a huge discovery. You know, if you go back to Mesopotamians or Egypt, they don't realize this. They think the social order is just, that's the way things are. And so the Greeks were able to start this thing that we call democracy in Athens. It wasn't a very good democracy by our standards. No women, lots of slaves who weren't part of it and so forth. But the basic ideal, the basic understanding that you can transform society to make it better. Well, bring that ideal, bring that Greek ideal. We can restructure society, bring it together with the Abrahamic ideal that we should be socially just. And what do you have? In the modern world, we have this great concern, this wonderful concern. As Gary Snyder talks about it, he talks about the mercy of the West being social revolution. Revolutions, but also evolutions. Democracy, laws, civil rights campaigns, anti-slavery movements, and all those things that I mentioned earlier. That's what comes out of that combination. And again, it seems to me that's been our highest ideal in the Western tradition. But the relationship is primarily dealing with government, with the state, with the way that it's organized, that we can reorganize it. That's been the focus on our collective ways of living together, trying to change them to make them more and more just. So now we can see we live in a socially just world, right? Well, not completely. And this is where I want to finish this little discussion about the Abrahamic or the Western side. Not completely, because although we've achieved a lot, it also seems like there are obstacles, and in some ways things are getting worse, right? We keep reading about how the gap between rich and poor is getting wider in our society. The last I heard, It's the worst it's been since 1916 or something like that. Enormous. And it's continuing to spread. So there seems to be some resistance. There seems to be something working against this tendency to have a more socially just society, right? What is that? Well, let's look at it this way. Suppose that you are a revolutionary leader who manages to overthrow a really nasty dictator. Now you're in complete power. You have control of the society. But here's the thing. If you haven't worked on your own greed, ill will, delusion, the three poisons, the three unwholesome roots, right? If you haven't worked on them, what's likely to happen? If you haven't got a handle on your own greed, it's going to be very hard not to take advantage of your situation, right? If you haven't worked on your own ill will, the tendency is going to be to understand the people who have other ideas as enemies to be defeated. And if you haven't worked on your own delusion of self, your own ego, you're going to tend to think the solution to all the social problems is simply making society do whatever you think it should do, something like that. What I'm trying to get at, of course, is that the resistance, why it is that we can probably never achieve the kind of social justice that we would like, has a lot to do with the fact of, even if you have, well, let me say it this way, even if you have the most perfect possible economic, social, political system, if the people within that system are still largely motivated by greed, ill will, and delusion, is that system going to work well? Obviously, I think not. My point being how social transformation, this urge for a more socially just society, can't work as well as it needs to if there is not also a concern for personal transformation. Does that make sense? Let me take a sip here. So, enough on the Western for the moment. Let's turn to the Buddhist side. I started out by talking about the role of morality. And so here I would like to contrast, as I understand it, the role of morality in Buddhism with the role in the Abrahamic traditions. Right? Of course, morality in Buddhism is also very important. It's foundational, right? So we have the 5 precepts, and they're extremely important. Nevertheless, they don't have the ultimate importance that they do in the Abrahamic, because there's something else in Buddhism. Sometimes I make the point that the precepts in the Buddhist traditions could be understood as like the training wheels in a bicycle. In principle, at least, the idea is once you learn how to ride a bicycle, you don't need the training wheels anymore, right? The same thing, ideally at least, again, in principle, it doesn't work always so well in practice. But the notion is that because the fundamental issue in Buddhism isn't just behaving morally, because the fundamental issue is really waking up, because the fundamental duality or axis is not good versus evil, rather the fundamental duality is between delusion, ignorance on the one side, and waking up, enlightenment, liberation on the other. And so the point here is that in principle, I keep having to come back to that, if we really wake up and realize our true nature, we don't need those training wheels. We don't need those precepts as something external to us, because then we won't be inclined to violate them. One way to say it is that if we really wake up and realize that we're not separate from other people, then we're not going to be inclined to want to take advantage of them, to disabuse our relationships, because we don't feel separate from them, right? I've just spent quite a bit of time talking about social justice in the Abrahamic and in the Western tradition. What's the corresponding term within Buddhism? Is it karma? It's kind of tricky. One way to say it is that there isn't really a correlative term in the Buddhist tradition. You might look at karma, but the irony is that the way karma has often been understood and practiced, it doesn't actually lead to the concern for social justice that the prophets were exemplifying, for example, right? The notion of karma, if you understand it as a kind of a cosmological moral law, the way it's often been understood is that, well, we don't need to worry about it. It's going to take care of itself, right? That sooner or later, people get what they deserve. You can't escape it. And therefore, we don't have to make efforts to make sure that that moral law is actually going to be enforced. It'll take care of itself. And in practice, what that has meant, of course, is that within the Asian Buddhist societies, it has encouraged a kind of passivity in relation to social justice issues. If we want to find a correlative, if we want to find the Buddhist term for social justice, I think what we really come down to again is the most important term in the Buddhist tradition. The Buddha doesn't really talk about justice, he talks about dukkha. Of course, that's the word usually translated as suffering, but it needs to be understood in the broadest possible sense, right? Not just physical and emotional pain, but dissatisfaction, frustration, anxiety, dis-ease, right? Dukkha is what the Buddha taught. That was the emphasis, right? He says, I teach dukkha and how to end it. But here's the interesting question. The dukkha that the Buddha taught about, did he from the beginning understand that only in terms of individual dukkha? Dukkha due to your own karma, due to your own individual greed, ill will, delusion? Or did he possibly have a somewhat broader social vision that might actually have encompassed what we might call social dukkha or institutionalized dukkha? Here we need to be a little bit careful because the way the tradition developed, of course, the focus has been almost solely on our own dukkha, our own karma, our own suffering, and our own awakening. And it's individual, it's private. It doesn't refer to collective karma or social dukkha caused perhaps by the king, the fact that he's a really nasty guy who oppresses the peasants. Buddhism really hasn't spoken to that. But my question is, and this is kind of a side reflection, because some scholars, not many, but a couple scholars wonder if the Buddha originally had a broader vision. There have been a couple people who've been arguing this. And it's maybe important for us not to project onto the Buddha's time our rather weakened understanding of religion, you see. We have an understanding of religion in the modern world that's very weak in comparison to earlier times, where religion, like in the Middle Ages, religion is central, right? But in the modern world, for a lot of people, it's Sunday morning, if that. So we have to be a little careful that we don't project our idea about what a religion is onto the Buddha and onto his time. And certainly we can see in some ways the Buddha was very progressive. When you look at his attitude, in particular, just the two that I would pick out, his attitude toward women and his attitude toward class or caste. Truly remarkable. I mean, if you look at the Buddhist time, the role of women in the Brahminical society, they were really, they didn't have equality, they didn't have many rights at all, they weren't allowed to do anything religious, and yet the Buddha welcomed them into the Sangha, saying that they had the same potential to awaken as men. Huge insight, huge sort of social development. Now the fact that after the Buddha died, the women's Sangha faded away, I think, to be quite honest, my suspicion is that the male monastics didn't like the competition. Really, I think so. And so and first of all, they rewrote the sutras to make sure that they controlled the women's Sangha, and then over time it sort of dwindled away. So to the point where virtually all Buddhist societies in Asia, became patriarchal, very patriarchal. So Buddhism, in that sense, wasn't able to fully resist the kind of patriarchy in a way that the Buddha himself seemed to do. Second example, of course, would be class or caste. The four main castes of India were not as fixed as they became later, but it's the same issue in the sense that the stratification was very important. And yet in the Buddhist Sangha, when you entered the Sangha, you lost all caste. That's huge. You're just one more person. And the priority is totally determined by when you join the Sangha, right? One of my favorite stories, there's no time to go into detail, was the story of Upali, right? The barber who he accompanied some high caste men who decided to join the order, and they tried to send Upali back with their fancy clothes and jewels. And he said, well, wait a minute, if I go back, people might think I've stolen them or killed you or something. So instead he said, I'm going to join the order too. So they all went together. And it's just this wonderful story. There's a couple different versions, I believe, in the canon about this. According to one version, the people said, the other Brahmins who wanted to enter the order, they actually said, we want Upali to be ordained first. And according to another story, the Buddha, I think, before he ordained the Brahmins, he actually sent them on a retreat. And while they were on a retreat, he ordained Upali, which meant Upali would forever be their senior in the Sangha. I mean, today we take democracy for granted, and so we don't realize how extraordinary progressive something like this was. And yet, to some extent, though, here's what I think happened to the Sangha. Despite this progressive attitude toward the Buddha, as far as I can tell historically, the early Sangha was to a large extent dependent not only on the newly emerging merchant class, but also on royalty. Dependent sometimes for material support, but also for toleration. Remembering that none of the Buddhist societies were democratic, right? So that meant any time the king wanted to squash you, give you a hard time, he could, because he had total power. So what it seems to me happened is something like this, that in order for the Sangha to survive, it had to come to some kind of accommodation with the powers that be, which again are not democratic, right? They're kings ruling by force and so forth. You had to have some relationship with the powers that be. But if you want to be supported by the powers that be, you'd better support the powers that be, you see? In other words, rather than Buddhism doing a kind of prophetic confronting the kings, which I don't see in its history, what we got into was something a little different. And from my reading of history, it seems to me that the karma doctrine could be and was used in this way, right? The king, if someone's born a prince, he must have really good karma from his past lifetime, so we should follow what he says. And if he becomes king, likewise, if someone is born really poor or disformed in some way, well, you must have really bad karma from your past lifetime, but don't blame anybody else. Likewise, if you're born a woman, well, I'm sorry, but if you behave yourself and do everything we men tell you to do, you have a chance of being born as a man in your past lifetime, and then you can enter the Sangha. Something like that. In other words, karma lends itself to this kind of, I would call it distortion of the basic Buddhist teachings, which ends up rationalizing the power of the king, including the dukkha created by the king. The king, he has a lot of the wealth, as much as he wants. He has the power. He can oppress with high taxes. He can impress men into the army and so forth. And Buddhism, as far as I can tell, never really worked as a counterforce to that kind of those kinds of social oppression. Do you see? Can you see where I'm going with this? Going back to what the Buddha said, that what he had to teach was dukkha, suffering, and how to end it. Here's the huge question, right? Are we just going to understand dukkha as individual? Or now, especially now that Buddhism comes to the West, or maybe we should say comes to the modern world, because the West isn't just the West anymore, it's really modernity, right? So now that Buddhism comes to the West, now that we have democracies and free speech, and Buddhism doesn't have to worry about not offending undemocratic rulers, this seems to open up new possibilities so that we can ask the question, is it just our individual dukkha, our individual karma? It seems like today we have so much insight into how dukkha is also created institutionally, also created collectively, that I think it's really important for Buddhism, whether this was the original intention of the Buddha is probably unanswerable, but clearly this is a possibility. And the Buddhist emphasis upon transformation, the fact that Buddhism always is transformed every time it goes to a very different culture, it just seems to open up new possibilities that we can bring the Buddhist perspective on delusion, ignorance, and so forth, the Buddhist concern to end suffering, and apply it to this broader social question. One way to say it is, if we understand dukkha in the broadest sense, not just as our individual problem, but as a more general social problem, the way Buddhism has developed in Asia, given the social political constraints it had, it hasn't been able to be as revolutionary. It hasn't been able to address these other kinds of dukkha. But today, it can. So I think you can see the point I'm making. The Western tradition, the Western concern for social justice is limited by the fact that we also need personal transformation if social transformation is to work as well as we'd like. And turning that around, the Buddhist concern for ending dukkha, if we understand that in the broadest sense, we have to not simply confine ourselves to individual karma, our own individual greed, ill will, delusion, but we also need to ask about the broader social and political implications of that. What do you think? Does that make any sense? Do I persuade you? Part 3. Let me try to say a little bit more about what I think Buddhism can distinctively offer if we really want to move in the direction of social dukkha. Remembering now that what's distinctive about Buddhism is not the good versus evil, but this delusion, especially delusion of self, the delusion versus awakening. The reason I ask this is you could say, okay, well, what Buddhism needs to do is just import this Western concern for social justice into its ways of thinking and teaching. And I think that that's a natural concern. I think that's something that is happening and is valuable. Nonetheless, only to stop with that would be to miss what I think are some of the really distinctive and important things that the Buddhist perspective, so I'm talking about the Buddhist worldview, and I want to suggest to you a couple ways that gives us a very distinctive insight, a very distinctive understanding of our particular social situation. There's too many things to talk about here, but I want to focus in particular on economics, our economic situation today, and to contrast that, and to contrast what I think Buddhism has to offer from the social justice, the usual way that's understood. What am I getting at here? From a social justice standpoint, what's the problem with our economic system? For the moment, let's just keep ourselves within the United States, right? What's the fundamental problem? Well, the problem that Robert Reich talks about in his new film. He's always going on about it. And by the way, I recommend this if you haven't seen it yet. Just out, Inequality for All. Wonderful new documentary. But I mean, he's getting at the basic point. The number one problem is inequality. As I mentioned earlier, this growing gap between rich and poor, by far the worst in any of the developed or overdeveloped or economized nations, however you want to describe them. This growing gap between rich and poor, and the solution, of course, social justice, would be more distributive justice. Why should the 1% have so much? Why should 400 families have an amount of wealth that's equivalent to the sort of bottom half of the American populace? I mean, this is simply unacceptable. So we need to find ways to balance it, maybe higher taxes, better social security, and so forth. And again, I wouldn't disagree with something like this, but I also want to contribute a Buddhist perspective on our economic situation in two ways. Saying a little bit about the individual economic situation, and then a little bit about the collective economic situation. In order to talk about the individual economic situation, I want to go back to what, for me, is the single most important teaching of the Buddha. And it's the connection that he makes and emphasizes between dukkha, suffering in the broadest sense, and anatta, or the delusion of a separate self. That to me is what really stands out. That there's many types of dukkha, but there's a fundamental dukkha built into the sense of a separate self. And as I would express it, by sense of separate self, it means the feeling that there's a me in here, somehow behind the eyes, inside the ears, whatever, that I'm in here and all of you and the rest of the world is out there. It's this sense of separation. And as I understand what the Buddha is saying, what he's pointing to is that this sense of separation is fundamentally dukkha. There's a fundamental anxiety built into it. One way to say it is that the sense of self in modern terms, it's a construct. The self isn't real, but this way of, babies aren't born with a sense of self. It's something that develops socially, psychologically. The sense of self is a construct, which because it's a construct, because it doesn't have any substantiality, it doesn't have any reality, it doesn't have any essence or being of its own, because it's only a bunch of processes, this construct that's the sense of me is inherently uncomfortable. By its very nature, it's anxious. As I like to express it, the sense of self is haunted by a sense of lack. The feeling that something is wrong with me. Something isn't quite right. Something is missing. And in fact, I think this is actually one of the great secrets of life. We all have this sense of lack deep down inside, but we don't realize that everyone does. We think it's our own private problem, and so we sort of hide it. We find ways to cope with it individually, not realizing, I think, that in a fundamental sense, everyone has this sense of lack. Okay, bring this back to the economic situation. On the one hand, as I understand the Buddha, this delusive sense of separate self is haunted by lack, anxiety, something is missing, I don't have something I need. Think how perfectly that fits in with a consumerist society. Right? A society, an economy that's based on consumption, based on advertising, based on persuading us that it's always the next thing we buy that will make us happy. Right? That's the kind of economic situation that we live in. We're surrounded by, advertising in almost every way. In fact, I would say consumerism is really a religion, in the sense that it fulfills the function of a religion. It tells us what's important and how to live. And we're all sort of caught up in this. Not only is it a religion, I suspect it's the fastest growing, most successful religion of all time, right? The way to be happy is to keep buying stuff, getting stuff, things, right? But do you see the point? Buddhism points out we have the sense of lack, and then we have an economy that takes advantage of that sense of lack, not to help us understand what the real source of the problem is, but to get us ever more mired in materialism, in debt, in thinking more and more, I've got to have this, I've got to have this, I've got to have that. This is a Buddhist perspective in our economic situation individually. And I think it's a pretty horrific one. Notice that this critique is not primarily a moral one. I'm not so much talking about good versus evil. I'm talking about delusion. Delusion of a separate self. The delusion that thinks, if I just get enough of this stuff, then I'll be happy, which is what we're all conditioned to believe. And of course, we never do get enough, right? So this is a very different perspective. This is a Buddhist perspective on our economic situation that I think gives us a very different insight. It suggests, of course, that it's not enough just to get more equal wealth in this country whereby, you know, that the middle class, okay, we need a better, stronger, bigger middle class. But if you just have a middle class that's still identifying itself in terms of consumption, that's not really going to solve the fundamental problem. That's not what's going to really make us happy. Then, in fact, it's going to have the opposite effect of just destroying the biosphere so much more quickly. So that's one individual perspective that I think Buddhism can offer. And I think it's a really important one that, you know, those of us who are Buddhist, I think we should be concerned to understand and to share this perspective, to bring it somehow into our national debate, national consciousness. But let me conclude with another example, a more collective example. Talking not about our individual relationship with consumption, but looking at the institutional role of corporate consumer capitalism. And here's what I'm getting at. I've already mentioned a couple times the three poisons, or also known as the three fires, the three unwholesome roots, three unwholesome motivations. Anybody remember what they are? Greed, ill will, that's the term I use, and delusion, right? Okay. It seems to me that today we not only have much more powerful technologies, we also have much more powerful institutions. And it's the nature of these institutions, this is where it really gets tricky. It's the nature of these institutions is that they end up taking on a life of their own, with their own motivations. So, it's not just that you and I have individual senses of self, there's also collective senses of self. And what I particularly want to point to is that there are some examples of collective selves that, in becoming institutionalized, to say it again, take on their own motivations, take on a life of their own, quite apart from the motivations of the individuals who are part of those institutions. In particular, here's what I'm trying to get at. I think that we have institutionalized the three poisons. I think today we have institutionalized greed. It's our economic system. We've institutionalized ill will. For that, we can point to our punitive justice punishment system, but in particular, our militarism. And finally, I think we have institutionalized delusion. It's our media, which aren't concerned to educate or inform us. The media is all about finding ways to grab our eyeballs and sell them to the highest bidder because they make their money from advertising. Now, we could spend a lot of time going through these three institutionalized poisons, but let me just say a few words about the first one, because that's the economic one, the example of institutionalized greed. If you understand greed as never enough, it seems to me that describes not only the way consumers, the way that we're taught to consume, but it also fits corporations very well, right? Corporations are never profitable enough. They're never big enough. Their market share is never big enough. Their stock value is never high enough. It can always be more and more. In fact, it's very hard to conceive what big enough could possibly be. It's the nature of that system that it has to keep growing if it's not to collapse. It's this sort of industrial growth model that everyone at the top levels of business and government takes for granted. The solution to everything, even the problems created by growth, the solution is always more growth, because then we'll have more money to deal with the problems created by growth. And So we get this kind of juggernaut, right? But here's the question. Why is more always better if it can never be enough? And that's my favorite line, so I'm going to repeat it. Why is more always better if it can never be enough? However, what I really want to focus on here is the institutional side, the fact that this system takes on a life of its own, which is frankly pretty horrifying. And one way to do that is to focus on the stock market. So let me just conclude by saying a few words about that. Looking at the stock market from two sides. From the one side, the investors. Millions and millions of mostly anonymous investors. Why are they in the market? Well, you know, if you have extra money, you play the market to hopefully you're going to make a killing, or at least you're going to make more money than you would if you left your money in the bank. But also you have things like pension funds and so forth, which are invested in the market. In many cases, of course, people who are in the market don't even know what corporations they're in, mutual funds and so forth. But millions and millions of investors, and again, their concern is return on investment. They're hoping for dividends, for higher stock prices, and so forth. That's what they're focused on. Not because they're bad people or anything, that's just the way the system works, right? That's just what you do if you have a bit of extra money. But now look, let's go to the other side of this, what I would call this black hole of responsibility. Okay, so the other side of the market, of course. Now the people here, the investors, they collectively, they own the corporations. So we go to the other side, and what do we have? We have CEOs, and of course all the other people working in the corporation, for whom they experience the expectations of the investors. How do they experience it? They experience it as this unremitting pressure for growth, for higher dividend price, higher dividends, etc., stock returns, etc. They experience this as this unremitting pressure for growth, for increased profitability. Unremitting, and preferably in the short run, because that's the way investors tend to think. So if you're the CEO of a large corporation, you have to respond to that expectation, or you're going to get out of a job pretty quickly, right? And the larger point is, when the people, with very few exceptions, the people here who are investing, they're not thinking green. They're not thinking about the larger, all the externalities. They're not thinking about the consequences socially or ecologically. In fact, it's very hard to think about that. You have to go to great efforts. But rather, they're only thinking about return, and that means the pressure that the CEOs feel is to meet that responsibility. And if that's true for the CEO at the top, of course, how much more true it's going to be for everyone else down the line. Suppose, for example, a CEO, maybe a CEO of a oil company. Suppose he, and I'm going to say he because it's usually a he, right? Suppose he wakes up one morning and suddenly something has happened. He's awakened, or at least he's awakened about the consequences of carbon in the atmosphere. And suddenly he wants to do everything he can to make the world a greener place. And he's aware of his responsibility, his corporation's responsibility or his corporation's role in that process. Okay. Now suppose he tries to change the way the corporation is structured to meet his concern. If what he wants to do is going to reduce profits, what's going to happen? He's going to be out. He's going to lose his job. Quite apart from his own concerns, from his own motivations. Do you see? My point is, he might be very well motivated. Everyone else in the corporation, to some extent, might be very well motivated, but it's the nature of the system that there are structural, institutional motivations built into the way the economic system works. If the CEO isn't able to meet expectations for profitability, he or she is going to get in a lot of trouble. Do you see my point? The point here is not simply that the economy sometimes does bad things. I'm saying that the motivation for growth very problematical motivation now. The motivation for growth is structurally built into the system, and it has a life of its own, completely apart from the motivations of any of the people involved, right? That is the trap that we are into nowadays. And if the Buddha is right, the Buddha didn't talk much about evil, but he talked about greed, ill will, delusion as like the three roots of evil. Well, if the Buddha is right about this, and if we've institutionalized these three, number one, this suggests that we've got a pretty serious problem, right? You can see how this gives us a different perspective on the situation that we're in, how Buddhism sheds a different light on, given the emphasis on greed, ill will, delusion, on the corporations or the economic system more generally as institutionalized greed, our militarism, institutionalized aggression, ill will, our media as institutionalized delusion. If the Buddha is right that they are the three roots of evil and we have institutionalized them, well, we're in a bad situation. It's pretty tough, and we better wake up to that. The other side of it, and this is my last comment, it also suggests that our social situation, institutionalized greed, ill will, delusion, that we can't think of spirituality as simply our own individual problem, dealing with our own individual greed, ill will, delusion. What we have is the macrocosm and the microcosm. We can see two aspects to the same system. It takes individual form, it takes institutional form. But I think there's a really important sense in which we can see these great challenges of our time are not just economic problems, not just ecological crises, they're not just political breakdown. In a really important sense, these larger issues are also spiritual challenges. And it's really important for us to address them, to acknowledge that and to find ways to address them, as well as dealing with our own greed, ill will, delusion. We are really, I think, all of us called upon today to find ways to work together to address our institutionalized greed, ill will, and delusion. Thank you.